In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the episcopal genealogy of the Coptic Orthodox Papacy during the early centuries of Ottoman rule in Egypt, starting with Pope John XIII, who took office in 1484, and ending with the election of Pope Mark VI in 1646. But this won't just be a dry list of names and dates. We'll also explore the broader ecclesiastical network of bishops and key church figures who played essential roles in sustaining that apostolic lineage. Before we delve into the historical details, it's important to highlight three major themes that defined this period. The first theme, decline, had already been set in motion during the later Mamluk period and only worsened under the early Ottomans. Around the year 1200, the Coptic Church reportedly had more than 2,000 churches and 800 monasteries across Egypt. By 1430, on the eve of the Ottoman conquest, those numbers had collapsed to fewer than 200 churches and only 74 monasteries. And by the end of the 16th century, the outlook was even bleaker. Just 112 churches and 5 monasteries remained in all of Egypt. As a result of this steep decline, the popes of this era were forced into near-constant crisis management. While their efforts were often heroic, they were largely reactive, focused on limiting losses and restoring what little they could. In many ways, these papacies were defined not by expansion or reform, but by the exhausting work of keeping together a crumbling church. The second theme, ecumenical dialogue, regained traction after the Council of Florence in 1442. As the Ottoman threat loomed large, Emperor John VIII Palaeologos and Pope Eugene IV of Rome sought to heal the rift between the Eastern and Western churches. To do this, they convened a new ecumenical council to be held in the city of Florence in Italy, and the Coptic Church sent one representative to attend, Higeman Andrew, the abbot of the monastery of St. Anthony. The council produced a document titled the Bull of Union with the Copts, aimed at reconciling the Chalcedonian divide. The Coptic Church ultimately rejected the terms of reunion, however, but the doors of dialogue had been reopened. Thus, the Council of Florence, while it didn't achieve its immediate goal, did reignite ecumenical interest that would carry on into the future. The final theme, the struggle for authority, played out within the church itself. Tensions between the papacy and the Arachina, the lay elites, only intensified during this era. These wealthy and politically connected figures often leveraged their influence to sway ecclesiastical appointments, church finances, and even matters of doctrine. At times, this struggle escalated into full-blown conflict. Lawsuits, public opposition, and even the imprisonment of sitting popes. Making matters worse, the Ottoman authorities often intervened, siding with whichever faction seemed more compliant or more financially rewarding. Popes therefore had to juggle spiritual leadership with political maneuvering. By the mid-1600s, the power imbalance had become so entrenched that the Arachina effectively controlled the church, reducing the pope's role to that of a spiritual figurehead. With all this in mind, let's begin our journey into the episcopal lineage of the Coptic Papacy during this extraordinary period of survival, adaptation, and quiet perseverance. Our starting point for this video is Pope John XIII, whose tenure marked a pivotal turning point in Coptic history. He was the sitting pope during the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, making him both the last pope of the Mamluk period and the first pope of the Ottoman period. John XIII was born in Sidfa, a town in the Asyut governorate of Upper Egypt, and he entered monastic life as a recluse at the monastery of Al-Muharra. His reign lasted from 1484 to 1524, an astonishing 40 years, 11 months, and 26 days. During that time, the papal seat remained at the Church of the Virgin Mary in Harid-Zuela, which had served as the patriarchal see since the time of Pope John VIII in 1320. Contemporary sources portray John XIII as deeply charitable, intellectual, and devout. Spiritually committed and theologically engaged, he authored several works on church rites and doctrines, demonstrating his dedication to both pastoral care and doctrinal continuity. One of the defining aspects of his tenure was the gradual erosion of the Church's authority over its far-reaching dioceses. By the High Middle Ages, the See of Alexandria had extended far beyond the borders of Egypt, reaching into Pentapolis, Ethiopia, Nubia, Jerusalem and the Near East, Cyprus, and Rhodes. But beginning in the 14th century, that influence began to unravel, and by the 15th century, institutional ties to many of these regions had grown tenuous at best. The first major casualty was Nubia. The last confirmed Coptic Archbishop of Nubia was Bishop Timothy of Faras, consecrated in 1372. After that, the historical record falls largely silent. The final mention of any bishop in Nubia appears in 1484, the same year John XIII was consecrated as pope. Not long after, the last Christian kingdom in the region, Dotao, collapsed around the turn of the 16th century. With its fall, Christianity in Nubia all but vanished, bringing an abrupt end to centuries of Coptic presence in the region. The Coptic presence there wouldn't be renewed until the mid-19th century. A similar decline played out in Pentapolis, a region traditionally honored as the birthplace of St. Mark and once a cornerstone of the Alexandrian See. By this time, however, it had undergone centuries of gradual Islamization. After the Ottomans took control, the region's final known metropolitan, Kyriakos, returned to Egypt and retired to the Syriac monastery in Shahit, adopting the name Severus, likely his name before consecration. After his death, no successor was appointed, and the see would remain dormant until Pope Shenouda III revived it in 1971. The church also faced growing tensions in Ethiopia, where Portuguese Catholic missionaries had begun making significant inroads, stirring religious unrest. Communication between Egypt and Ethiopia had always been difficult, resulting in long vacancies of the Ethiopian See. These vacancies, which had been common throughout the medieval period, were now becoming dangerous due to the presence of Catholic missionaries. To prevent a leadership vacuum, an unusual solution was attempted. In 1481, Pope John XIII consecrated two metropolitans for Ethiopia simultaneously. The first metropolitan, Isaac, served as the diocesan bishop. The second, Metropolitan Mark, was appointed as his coadjutor, a sort of understudy who would assist him, learn the local language and customs, and seamlessly take over when needed. Later, a third bishop, Metropolitan James, was consecrated to succeed Mark, continuing the chain of succession. Although this practice was canonically irregular, since church law generally forbids multiple bishops for a single see, this approach reflects the urgency of the moment. Sadly, the plan ended up falling apart. Metropolitan James died before he could succeed Metropolitan Mark, and Metropolitan Mark passed away shortly after. This opened the door for João Bermudez, a Portuguese emissary, to fill the vacuum. He managed to convert the Ethiopian Emperor David II to Roman Catholicism, and then traveled to Rome, where he claimed he had been consecrated as Latin Patriarch of Ethiopia. This triggered a temporary but serious schism between the Coptic and Ethiopian churches. The only foreign diocese that seemed stable during Pope John's time was the Diocese of Cyprus and Rhodes. Coptic presence there dates back to the 12th century, and had grown steadily, spurred by trade ties and waves of immigration during periods of persecution in Egypt. The community there eventually became large enough to warrant its own metropolitan. Two bishops are known to have served there during Pope John's tenure. The first, Metropolitan Michael the Cypriot, was likely a native of the island. He appears among the recipients of a synodal letter issued by Pope John in 1509. He was probably elderly at that point, as the note beside his name mentions his retirement. The second, Metropolitan Abraham, was the teacher of a monk to whom Pope John dedicated a canonical collection titled The Spiritual Medicine in 1515 AD. A manuscript of this work, with its dedication, still survives today in the library of the Syrian monastery in Shahit. Among the bishops consecrated during the tenure of Pope John XIII was Bishop Michael, the son of Mehenna. His exact diocese remains uncertain, as 4 bishops bearing that same name are recorded during this period. What distinguishes this Bishop Michael from the others is his family connection. He was the older brother of the future Pope Gabriel VII. Both brothers were sons of Higaman John, who had served as the parish priest at the famous church of St. Mercurius in Old Cairo. While the historical sources do not name the bishop who presided over the consecration of Pope Gabriel, I've chosen to highlight Bishop Michael as a symbolic figure, given both his potential involvement and the unusual scenario of a biological brother playing a role in papal succession. Pope Gabriel VII was born in a village west of Al-Usayya in Asyut, not far from Al-Muharram monastery. It was probably his family's original hometown before relocating to Old Cairo. He later became a monk at the monastery of the Syrians in Shahit, where he took the monastic name Raphael. Contemporary descriptions portray him as tall and reserved, deeply ascetic, and committed to fasting, prayer, and rigorous simplicity. His papacy lasted from 1525 to 1568 AD, a remarkable 43 years and 25 days. One of the most significant events of his tenure was the resolution of the brief but serious schism between the Coptic and Ethiopian churches. In 1540, Ethiopia's Catholic-aligned Emperor David II passed away. His son, Emperor Claudius, sought to restore communion with the Coptic Church and formally requested a new Orthodox metropolitan. Pope Gabriel responded in 1547 by ordaining Joseph III as Metropolitan of Ethiopia. This marked the official end of the schism. In 1551, he also ordained a coadjutor for Metropolitan Joseph named Metropolitan Peter II. When Metropolitan Joseph III died around year 1559 AD, Metropolitan Peter II succeeded him and served until his own death in 1570. Pope Gabriel VII also reopened the door to Catholic Orthodox dialogue for the first time since the failed attempt at the Council of Florence. In 1561, more than a century after the council, Pope Paul IV of Rome sent 2 Jesuit delegates to Egypt inviting the Coptic Church to participate in the ongoing Council of Trent. Pope Gabriel welcomed them warmly and assigned 2 Coptic theologians to examine their faith. Based on the theologians' reports, he recognized the Jesuits as legitimate Orthodox clergy and granted them permission to minister throughout Egypt, administering sacraments to the Orthodox faithful. At one point, Gabriel VII even expressed willingness to send a delegation to the council and came close to signing a joint declaration of faith. However, he ultimately pulled back. Some sources say the opposition came from the Coptic clergy, particularly an unnamed Metropolitan of Cyprus. Others credit the protest of a young monk who would one day become Pope Gabriel VIII. Pope Gabriel VII passed away in 1568 while traveling by boat along the Nile en route to the monastery of St. Anthony in El-Maymun. Among the bishops consecrated by Pope Gabriel VII were Ioannis of Akhmim, Kyrillos of Al-Usiyya, Gregory of Qusqam, and Michael of Na'ada. Their names are preserved in a Waqf deed recorded for the monastery of Al-Muharraq near the end of Baramhat, 1280 AM. Although no direct evidence survives of these bishops officiating at the consecration of Pope John IV, it is reasonable to assume that at least one of them lived into the following 6 years and took part. For the purposes of continuing the episcopal genealogy, I've chosen Bishop Michael of Na'ada. While his role is not explicitly documented, his position as the final signatory in the Waqf suggests that he was the most recently consecrated, and therefore likely the youngest, making him the most probable candidate to have taken part in the subsequent papal consecration. The next patriarch, Pope John XIV, was born in Manfalot in Asyut Governorate, and later embraced the monastic life at the monastery of the Virgin El-Baramos in Skidus. He was already advanced in age when he was elected patriarch, so his tenure, which lasted from 1571 to 1586, was relatively brief when compared to the long reigns of his 2 predecessors. A defining feature of his papacy was a sharp uptick in Ottoman persecution of the Copts. This included stricter dress codes, increased jizya tax, and a growing pattern of preferential treatment towards foreign Christians over the native Copts. His papacy was also marked by the rapid collapse of the Coptic Orthodox Diocese of Cyprus and Rhodes. The turning point came in 1570, when the Ottoman Empire invaded Cyprus, then under Venetian control. After the conquest, a wave of religious persecution swept across the island, during which many Coptic clergy, including the serving metropolitan, were martyred. The Coptic presence on the island quickly began to fade, vanishing entirely by the late 17th century. While a small Coptic community has re-emerged in modern-day Cyprus, it remains directly under the jurisdiction of the Coptic Pope in Egypt and has no local bishop of its own. In 1583, Pope Gregory XIII of Rome sent a delegation to Egypt to reignite ecumenical dialogue. During their initial meeting with Pope John XIV, the Catholic envoys assured him that their reunion with Rome would not require any change to the Coptic rites or theology. Their only condition for reunion was that the Coptic Church acknowledged the universal jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff over all of its bishops. Known for his gentle and conciliatory nature, Pope John took their offer in good faith. He saw it as a sincere attempt at unity and convened a meeting of the Holy Synod that same year to consider the proposal. Initially, the bishops resisted. Most of them rejected the Roman interpretation of Petrine primacy, viewing it as an uncanonical development and a threat to Coptic independence and doctrine. But through Pope John's persuasion, the Synod eventually reached a tentative agreement. They voted to reconvene at a later date to review, finalize, and sign a formal statement of reunion, which was drafted by the Catholic delegates. However, the situation quickly deteriorated. Renewed waves of Ottoman persecution forced Pope John to leave Cairo and take refuge in Alexandria. The bishops also dispersed back to their own dioceses. In 1586, concerned about delaying the Catholic delegates any further, Pope John called for the Synod to reconvene in Cairo. But during the difficult journey back, the elderly pope fell ill and died near the village of An-Nahariya. His body was temporarily buried in Burma before being transferred to the monastery of the Syrians in Shahit. Meanwhile, the Ottoman governor grew suspicious of the Catholic delegates, He accused them of espionage and had them arrested. Prominent Copts intervened, however, and raised a bail of 5,000 gold coins to secure their release, after which the delegates were expelled and returned to Rome. Disillusioned by the mission's failure, some Catholic sources later speculated that Pope John had been poisoned by opponents of the Union, though there is no evidence to support that claim. One of the bishops consecrated by Pope John XIV was Metropolitan Zachariah of Jerusalem. He is generally believed to have served from 1575 to 1600 AD, making him the first recorded Coptic hierarch for the See of Jerusalem since Metropolitan Peter II, who had held the office from 1341 to 1362. That's a gap of over a century, with no recorded bishops in Jerusalem. Metropolitan Zechariah is especially significant for having presided over the consecration of the next patriarch, Pope Gabriel VIII. Pope Gabriel was born in the village of Mir in Asyut and became a monk by the name of Shenouda at the monastery of St. Bishoy in Shahit. He was consecrated as patriarch in 1587 and served until his death in 1603. As mentioned earlier, some sources credit Pope Gabriel VIII with having dissuaded his indirect predecessor, Pope Gabriel VII, from finalizing his union with Rome. Yet, ironically, Catholic sources claim that Pope Gabriel VIII himself was more favorable to reunion than any of the previous popes, and they even claim that he had signed a bull of reunion with Rome in 1597 AD. Coptic sources, on the other hand, deny that any formal union ever took place, claiming that just like the earlier ecumenical attempts, this one also failed prematurely. With that said, there was in fact an increase in correspondence between Alexandria and Rome during Pope Gabriel VIII's papacy. Some surviving letters even mention financial aid sent from the Vatican to the Coptic Church. One particularly notable exchange occurred in 1589 AD when Pope Sixtus V wrote to Pope Gabriel urging him to adopt the Gregorian calendar reform, especially with regards to the calculation of the date of the Feast of the Resurrection. To consider this matter, Pope Gabriel convened a council of the clergy, arachina, and scholars, who in turn commissioned Egypt's leading astronomers to produce independent calculations. These calculations were ultimately adopted in place of the Roman reform. In addition, Pope Gabriel also introduced several adjustments to the timing and duration of certain fasts. While these reforms were generally welcomed in Cairo, they sparked fierce resistance in Lower Egypt. Some even sued the Pope in Islamic courts, accusing him of violating church canon and overstepping the limits of his authority as defined by Islamic law. These disputes cast a long shadow over his papacy, and although he held firm during his lifetime, all of his reforms were discreetly reversed after his death. After the death of Pope Gabriel, the most senior bishop at the time, Bishop Christodoulos of Naada, presided over the consecration of the next patriarch, Pope Mark V. Beyond this passing mention, little else is known about his life or ministry. Pope Mark V was born in the village of El Bayadiyah near Malawi in El Minya Governorate. Before joining monastic life at the monastery of St. Macarius in Shahit, he had worked as a land surveyor. As a monk, he became known for his deep piety and thorough knowledge of the church canons. He was consecrated as patriarch in 1603 AD. His papacy was marked by significant internal conflict. The arachina of Lower Egypt continued their efforts to undermine papal authority. This time, the battle was about church teaching itself, particularly the doctrines of fasting and monogamy. But unlike their previous challenges that went through the Islamic courts, this time the arachina led by a man named Fadlallah al-Dimirdashi took their complaints directly to the Ottoman governor of Egypt. According to some sources, they were even aided in their endeavor by the Metropolitan of Damyat. According to some sources, they were even aided in their endeavor by an unnamed Metropolitan of Damyat. A copy of their petition still survives, and its language is notably deceptive. They deliberately misrepresented Orthodox liturgical practices as acts of tyranny and idolatry. The Ottoman governor, a reform-minded official who prioritized public welfare, was misled by their testimony into viewing Pope Mark as an authoritarian figure. Consequently, the Pope was imprisoned in the Tower of Alexandria, and the governor gave them permission for the consecration of a new patriarch. The arachina of Lower Egypt wasted no time. They convinced a monk who coincidentally was from the same village as Pope Mark to accept consecration as a rival patriarch, and he accepted being consecrated as Patriarch John. But their plan quickly hit a wall. The arachina of Cairo refused to recognize this anti-pope and successfully negotiated Pope Mark's release in 1611 AD. Once freed, Pope Mark swiftly reasserted his authority, and the anti-Pope John, realizing the error of his way, withdrew to the monastery of St. John the Short near Malawi. There he lived the rest of his days as a vine dresser, fading quietly into obscurity. Pope Mark V continued to lead the church in relative peace until his death in 1619 AD. One of the more peculiar documents preserved in the patriarchal archives from this period is the formal declaration of investiture of Metropolitan James I of Jerusalem, dated to June 16th of 1604 AD. According to this record, during a papal visit to the Holy City, Pope Mark V inspected the Coptic properties in the region and appointed Higaman James as head of the See of Jerusalem. This document is striking for two reasons. First is the phrasing of the title itself, head of the See of Jerusalem. While the wording here may seem ambiguous, it is widely understood that James, like his predecessors and successors, was consecrated as Metropolitan of Jerusalem. The atypical form of the title, however, may reflect internal debates within the Coptic Church over the rank and authority of its bishop in Jerusalem, especially in light of the fact that Jerusalem had been elevated to patriarchal status at the Council of Chalcedon. The second reason is the location of his consecration. The document's language implies that Pope Mark V performed the consecration in Jerusalem itself. If this detail is accurate, it would represent a significant departure from standard practice, since typically, bishops were consecrated in Cairo at the Patriarchal See before being dispatched to their respective dioceses. This would make Metropolitan James's ordination a highly unusual event that stands out in the historical record. Finally, Metropolitan James also holds particular significance as the presumed officiant at the consecration of the next patriarch, Pope John XV. Pope John XV was born in Merlawi in Armenia before becoming a monk at the monastery of St. Anthony. Known for his studious nature, he dedicated much of his life to poring over ancient manuscripts, particularly those on patristic and canon law. His reputation must have been formidable, as he was consecrated just 7 days after the death of his predecessor. He served as patriarch from 1619 to 1628. He was renowned for his humility, purity of heart, and unwavering devotion to prayer. Historical sources suggest that he came into conflict with the Arakhina due to their expanding influence. One of his boldest reforms was transferring the administration of ecclesiastical endowments, known as Awqaf, from the lay leaders back to the local clergy. During his tenure, Pope John earned the epithet the Just Judge, a reflection of his steadfast commitment to truth and justice. He was known for holding all people, regardless of status, to the law of God, resisting all bias and pressure with remarkable courage. It was this same zeal for righteousness that, according to tradition, led to his tragic death. During a pastoral visit to Upper Egypt, Pope John stayed in the house of a local nobleman in the region of Abnub. There he discovered that his host was keeping concubines, and he rebuked him. In retaliation, the nobleman allegedly poisoned the Pope's water. As his health declined and his hair reportedly fell out, he asked to be taken back north by boat. Suffering greatly, he died on the journey. When the boat reached the town of Al-Bayadiyah, his companions stopped to hold his funeral, and he was ultimately buried at the monastery of St. Bishoy in Shahit. In addition to the turmoil which Pope John XV faced in Egypt, new challenges also arose in Ethiopia during the 1620s, about midway through his papacy. The Ethiopian Church once again entered into schism with the Coptic Patriarchate, this time under the leadership of Emperor Sicinius. Sicinius had seized the crown through war from his cousin, Emperor James. During that conflict in 1607, Metropolitan Peter III of Ethiopia had sided with James, and both were killed at a battle. In the aftermath, Sicinius appealed to Pope Mark V for a new metropolitan, and Pope Mark sent him Metropolitan Simon, who officiated his coronation in 1608. Not long after, however, the Spanish Jesuit missionary Pedro Paez persuaded Sicinius to convert to the Roman Catholic Church. This conversion provoked an Orthodox uprising led by the emperor's son-in-law, Prince Julius, and supported by Metropolitan Simon. Sicinius again defeated and killed both in battle in 1617. In 1622, following his conversion, Emperor Sicinius formally recognized the Catholic Church as the state church of Ethiopia. Later, he accepted the Jesuit Afonso Mendez as the Latin Patriarch of Ethiopia, forcing all Ethiopian clergy to submit to him and thereby fully severing communion with the Coptic Church. In 1624, he also issued a manifesto attempting to justify his betrayal of orthodoxy and his break with Alexandria. In this manifesto, he accused the last three Coptic metropolitans, Christodoulos I, Peter III, and Simon, of corruption, immorality, and political opportunism. He claimed that their sinful lifestyles and constant interference had destabilized the empire. Unfortunately, these polemical accusations form the only surviving testimony about these bishops. Outside of the emperor's declaration and other Jesuit writings, almost nothing remains about their lives or ministries. Among the bishops who lived during Pope John XV's tenure was Metropolitan Peter of Bahnesa. He is remembered for compiling a lectionary containing the liturgical readings of the Church at the time. Sadly, this lectionary has not survived to the present day. Another contemporary bishop was Metropolitan John the Syrian. He is known primarily for one key role. He presided over the consecration of the next patriarch, Pope Matthew III. Beyond that, very little is known about his life or service. His epithet, the Syrian, is intriguing and has led to several theories about his identity. The most likely explanation is that the title reflects his ethnic background. Metropolitan John may have been a bishop within the Coptic Church who was of Syriac ancestry. The Coptic Church has long included clergy of Syriac heritage. For example, Pope Damien I, Simeon I, Abraham I, Mark III, and John X were all of Syriac descent. A significantly more recent example of Syriac clergy in the Coptic Church is Bishop Isidoros of the Paramos Monastery. Another possibility is that the epithet refers not to his ethnicity but to his place of service, specifically the Monastery of the Virgin Mary, better known as the Monastery of the Syrians in Shahid. Originally gifted to the Syriac Orthodox Church in the 6th century, it became a major hub for Syriac monasticism in Egypt. By the 15th century, however, Coptic monks had begun to resettle in the monastery, likely after the destruction of their own nearby monastery of St. John Cama. For a time, and until around the late 17th century, both Copts and Syriacs shared the space. Following the return of Metropolitan Kyriakos of Pentapolis to the monastery, he assumed the position of abbot. Notably, Kyriakos was himself of Syriac origin, hailing from the region of Mount Lebanon. Upon his death, another metropolitan, Severus, was appointed to serve as abbot in his place. Unfortunately, the historical record regarding the succession of abbots in the monastery is fragmentary. It is possible that Metropolitan John the Syriac was himself a member of the monastery, either of Syriac or Coptic origin, who, like his predecessors, was elevated to the rank of metropolitan, either to maintain continuity or to provide episcopal oversight for the monasteries of Shahid. A third and far less likely explanation is that Metropolitan John was actually a bishop of the Syriac Orthodox Church. While it is permissible for bishops from other apostolic traditions to participate in episcopal or patriarchal consecrations, they typically do not take the lead in such rites. The honor is reserved for the most senior of the local church's bishops, in order to preserve the apostolic succession within each church's own heritage. Whatever the truth of the matter may be, Metropolitan John the Syrian remains a somewhat enigmatic figure, remembered solely for his part in the consecration of Pope Matthew III. Pope Matthew III was born in the town of Tuch in El Menufeya Governorate, and his name was originally Tedros. He later entered the monastery of St. Macarius, where he quickly stood out for his noble character, humility, knowledge, and piety. These qualities earned him the respect of his fellow monks, and they eventually elected him as their abbot. During his leadership, he also gained valuable administrative experience when Pope John XV entrusted him with overseeing the monastery's Awqaf. These qualities made him a natural choice for the papacy, and he was consecrated shortly after Pope John XV's death. His patriarchate lasted from around 1628 until his own death in 1646. One of Pope Matthew's first official acts was to formalize an agreement with the Ottoman authorities, affirming that all ecclesiastical Awqaf were to be administrated directly by the Pope and the clergy whom he appoints. This was a strategic and effective move that curtailed the influence of the Arakhina over church property and reinforced the authority of the patriarchal office. His reign was relatively long and peaceful, marked by much-needed stability. He passed away during a visit to his hometown, and he is said to have foretold his death shortly before it happened. In 1632, Emperor Sisinius of Ethiopia abdicated, and his successor, Emperor Basilides, restored orthodoxy as the official faith of the empire. Soon after, he requested that Pope Matthew III appoint a new Orthodox metropolitan for the Ethiopian Church. Following a brief delay, Pope Matthew consecrated a monk from the monastery of St. Anthony and sent him to Ethiopia as Metropolitan Mark III. During his journey, Metropolitan Mark stopped at the Red Sea port of Sawakin, where he met the exiled Latin patriarch Afonso Mendes and his Jesuit entourage who had been expelled from Ethiopia after the restoration of orthodoxy. Mark, who was familiar with the Jesuit mission of Upper Egypt, greeted them warmly and assured Mendes that he would do his best to protect the rights of the remaining Catholic minority in Ethiopia. Metropolitan Mark arrived in Ethiopia in 1635 and formally assumed his role. True to his word, he attempted to defend the Catholic community there, but the memory of the previous emperor's forced imposition of Catholicism had left a bitter legacy. Despite Metropolitan Mark's best efforts, the persecution of Catholics continued. His reluctance to get involved in political power plays at court, combined with his leniency towards Catholicism, led to his dismissal by a council of Ethiopian clergy in 1640. He spent the rest of his life in exile and died in 1648. After Metropolitan Mark's exile, Pope Matthew III consecrated 2 more bishops for Ethiopia, Metropolitan John and Metropolitan Michael IV. When they arrived, Emperor Basileus rejected Metropolitan John and sent him back to Egypt, while Metropolitan Michael IV was officially installed and served as the sole recognized Metropolitan of Ethiopia until around 1660 AD. Among the other bishops consecrated by Pope Matthew III was Metropolitan Christodulus I of Jerusalem. He served from 1631 to 1648 and is remembered chiefly for having presided over the consecration of the next patriarch, Pope Mark VI. Beyond that, the historical record tells us very little about his life or ministry. And with that, we'll pause our journey here. God willing, in the next installment of this series, we'll pick up from Pope Mark VI and explore the Coptic Papacy during the later Ottoman centuries, leading up to the time of the French expedition to Egypt. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and share it with others. For more content on Coptic Orthodox tradition, history, and theology, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And as always, if you have any questions, thoughts, or corrections, drop them in the comments below. Until next time, Awqaf choice.